Hi, everybody, and welcome to another Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants broadcast. I'm Sarah, and if this is your first time joining us, Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants is all about bringing science, conservation, and adventure to classrooms across the world. And everything we do goes to our YouTube channel, so thank you for joining in if you guys are coming in through there. And you're also able to go back and revisit some of the places that we've explored through our YouTube channel as well. And this week we are having our Oceans Week celebration, where we celebrate the ocean every year with a week featuring talks with scientists and conservationists on the front lines of ocean exploration and research. And this week we have 21 broadcasts, and today's program is collaborating with the National Research Council of Canada, and across the globe, we rely on the ocean as a natural buffer to climate change and as a vital source of oxygen. And the National Research Council of Canada's ocean scientists are working to better understand these coastal and oceanic changes as well. And today we have over 360 kids in classrooms across North America joining us. So thank you for tuning in today. And we have Adrian here, who will be telling us about some of the work he's been doing to detect and quantify microplastics in our environment so we can better understand them and their impact on living things. So I'm going to bring Adrian in here. And hey, Adrian, nice to see
you.
Adrian, I know you have a great conversation with us, so I'll get out of here and I can bring up your presentation here and let you take it away.
Great. Okay.
All right. Go ahead.
Great. Thanks a lot. So today I'm going to tell you about some of the work that I do. So I mostly measure small things. But before I get into that, I'll tell you about where I work at the National Research Council. So I work in the Metrology Research Center. And so metrology is probably a word that nobody has heard before. And most people, when they hear it, they think, oh, you've just mispronounced meteorology, which is the study of weather. Well, metrology is actually the study of measurement. And so what we do is we try to develop new tools for measuring things. When someone has a measurement problem, they say, I can't measure this, I don't know how to measure this, they can come to us and we work with them to develop new tools for measuring things. And so I work in the nanoscale measurement team. Nano meaning very small. So basically what we do is we try to set up new tools and new ways of measuring small stuff. And so that's where it leads me to that's my connection to microplastics. So what are microplastics? So this background here is a picture of microplastics in the water. Now for me, these are actually kind of big because I can still see these ones. So microplastics are anything typically below 5 millimeters in size. So 5 millimeters, that's a few notches on the ruler, you can see that. But then we get smaller and smaller and smaller, and then you can't see these things anymore. And that's where I come in. So that's the type of thing that I try to work with, to try to develop new ways of measuring these microplastics. So that's what I'm going to tell you about. Is like, what kind of measurements can we do? How do we go about measuring things, and what can we learn? So the first thing is, where do microplastics come from? Well, one of the sources of microplastics is actually, it is in some products. Toothpaste used to have microplastic beads in it. We don't do that anymore. That's mostly been banned. It's not really used for cosmetic purposes anymore. But so we still do have some products that are microplastics. Well, a lot of it is waste. And so waste that ends up in the ocean and starts to break down over time. And so what does this breakdown process look like? Well, you can just imagine it's, okay, take this plastic and it's going to start to break into smaller and smaller pieces. So this weekend I was cleaning up and I actually happened to find an old plastic bag that had been at some point left out in the sun, exposed to UV. And then I put it away. When I found it later, it had turned all brittle. So plastic is normally, nice and flexible, but this plastic is now brittle. And so you can imagine if I take that plastic and I throw it into the ocean so that waves are moving it around, tearing it apart, it breaks into smaller and smaller pieces. And so the question becomes, how small do these pieces become? Is there kind of a lower limit? And then, so that's one question that people ask us, like, how small is the stuff? They also want to know how much of it is there? How many of these small particles are there? We'd also like to know kind of what kinds of plastic are they? Are they mostly from one source? Are they from all different sources? And so that's another question that people ask us. And then a big question that people ask us, but we work on with a lot of other people. This is the big question is, these small microplastics, how do they affect biology? And the reason people want to know that is that if I take like a bottle or some big piece of plastic, and specifically for an animal, let's say it eats it, we can kind of figure out what that does. It's big, it gets stuck in their digestive system, it's bad for the animals. That's clear. For micro and nanoplastics, though, these are so small that you could eat them and they could just go straight through you, come out the other end, and away they go. Or they could go actually through your gut and they can get into your blood, into your body, or if you breathe them, they could get into your lungs. And so it becomes a really complicated thing of determining where do these microplastics go, how do they affect living things, what's going on. And so that's kind of what I'm going to get to at the end. And that is a really complicated question. But so the first thing is, how small are the particles? How many are they? Well, we actually need quite a few different set of tools for doing that. So I'm going to show you one this is just an illustration of how one of these tools works, but it's something that, I did this at home, but it's something it's actually a very powerful technique and it works really well. So what I have here is cornstarch in water and clean water. And so cornstarch, not microplastics, but it more or less works. And so you can see I have a really concentrated solution. If I take just a few drops of this cornstarch in water solution and top it up, will I be able to see my particles anymore? And so when there's lots of particles, you can see it easily, but when there's only a few, you don't see it anymore. So how am I going to measure what's here? Well, if you've ever been in a dark room and seen light shining through a window, you can see dust. And that idea works here too. So you can basically use dust to see these particles. Now, that's actually not very precise. We want to be a bit more precise in how we do the measurement. So to do that, instead of using a flashlight, we use lasers. So if I shine a laser into these kind of samples, what I can see is when I go into this very few particles, now I can actually start to see the individual particles. I can see them moving around. I can see them scattering light. And this is actually how we go about doing the measurement. And what's nice about this, especially for when we want to say measure in the ocean, is we can take water samples, put them in the device and measure right away and get a count. Roughly how many particles are there? And then by watching how they move in the water, how they tumble over time, how they float or don't, we can get some sense of their size, their density, their shape. And so that's basically the kind of that fast screening that we actually do. That you can actually do a lot of work with. It's just basically how do these particles scatter light? And that gives us already a lot of information about these really small particles. Now, what happens if we want to look at particles that are really, really small? Even smaller than this, like you wouldn't see any scatter light. Well, to do that, we use a different tool. And that's something it's called atomic force microscopy. Maybe you haven't heard of it, but it's actually also has kind of an intuitive, hopefully easy way to understand how these things work. So to illustrate it, I'm going to just first start with tracing. So I took a piece of Lego at home and I traced it with a highlighter. It's like the highlighter is kind of it's a nice thick pen, but it gives me some sense of the outline of what I'm tracing. I then use a pen, and it's a little bit finer tip. And there's some more detail there I can find if I trace my part, do a bit better job tracing. And I can use a really fine tip pen and trace out my piece really well and really get a better idea of what the shape is. And actually, it turns out with a fine enough tip, I can do a pretty good job of recreating the thing the image of the thing that I started with. Now, imagine that I take a tip, and instead of a pen, I take the sharpest thing that we can make. This is a tip that is only a few atoms across. This is a really, really small tip. But once I have that, now I can trace with really, really high resolution. I can really trace exactly all the shapes, all the contours of these really small particles. So that's what we do. So if we take a water sample, for example, we dry it out and we are left with particles. Now, I could show you a picture of the galaxy or I could show you a picture of particles and they look about the same. And to give you, I put a scale bar on it because we have to know kind of what we're measuring, but that scale bar, at least for me, it's not really that intuitive. It's just like, it's 5 micrometers. Micrometers, that's small. There's a lot of small stuff there. Maybe if we have a bit more of a useful scale. So this is what a human hair would look like on the same scale, and not hair from my head. This hair is coarse hair. I'm talking about the finest hair you can find. if I took a hair from my head, it would fill the whole screen. So this is really, really fine hair. And basically everything we're measuring would fit within that hair. And we can actually zoom in to one dot in that image and see those particles. And so by taking this really fine tip and tracing it around and carefully measuring, what we can do is we can actually measure around, over top, and we can measure the size of all these particles. We can start to figure out how big they are, what their shape is, how they look. So that's step one. We can measure how many there are by measuring the scattered light. We can measure their shape, either by how they tumble around in the water, or if we want to be really precise, using this AFM and tracing them out one at a time. But we also want to know what kind they are, because the kind of the particle they are is going to tell us about maybe where we need to clean up or how toxic they might be. And so for plastics, I can show you, this is not work that we did, but it's a really nice example. So what they did in this group is they went to the beach and said, let's just collect a whole bunch of plastics that are plastic particles on the beach. And they found white plastic and colored plastic. Well, white and colorful plastic, that doesn't tell me what kind it is. That just tells me what color it is. That's not particularly helpful in determining, did it come from a lunch container? Did it come from a water bottle? Where did it come from? And this can be a problem when you only use visible light. So what does visible light mean? Well, visible light, so when you think about the sun, bright white light, when I look at a rainbow, I know that that light is made up of different colors, right? The sunlight goes through the water vapor and it separates out. I see all the different colors of the rainbow. But it turns out that there's a lot more colors than just the visible light. We have ultraviolet. So ultraviolet is the thing that gives you a sunburn. There's X-rays. We use that for looking at bones. There's gamma rays. Those are all coming from the sun. But those are all shorter wavelengths of light. There's also longer wavelengths of light, like microwaves and radar and radio waves. And what we use for studying plastics a lot is infrared. And so this example here is a photograph of a tree in the visible and a photograph of a tree in the infrared. And infrared is you've actually experienced in your everyday life. If you've ever gone up to a fire and said, nice and warm, that's infrared. And it turns out that for plastics, if you look at them in the infrared, they look different from each other. So different types of plastics will look different. And so if you use the right kind of detectors, the right kind of lights, you can actually then go in and say, I'm going to measure, take a picture in the infrared and say, this is from a water bottle. This is from a plastic bag. This is from a piece of styrofoam packing material. And so when you do that, you can then take these same types of things. So white and clear plastics, turns out they're not all the same. They're different kinds of plastics. Then you can sort them. And you can find out that even though they're different colors, the colors are set by dyes we add to the plastic. Even though they're different colors, we can actually start to sort them out and determine what kind of plastic is which. And so those are kind of the tools that we use for looking at plastics. So where do we use these tools? So I'm going to just show you a few examples of projects we've worked on. So one is we actually look at wastewater. So this is basically water that if it wasn't treated, and for example, if there's a flood, ends up in rivers, ends up in the ocean. And so when they treat wastewater though, they kind of try and suck everything up, get all the dirty stuff out, and then dispose of it somehow. Some of it actually gets turned into fertilizer. So that's actually where we come in. So we want to take this waste stuff and figure out how toxic is this waste stuff? Where's the plastic? What's going on in there? And so we take this waste product and we dissolve it in water. We mix it up. Now, one of the things you may have seen is that like a water bottle floats. So actually a lot of plastics float when you mix it up. So the rocks fall out, the plastics float. Great, we got some plastics. But we also have lots of other stuff. Now, one of the problems of plastic is that plastic is really hard to break down. It basically resists breaking down in a lot of chemical processes. So that's bad for the environment, but kind of good for us, because when we want to do the measurement, we want to say, let's figure out how much plastic is here. We can use chemical processes to break things down. We can stick bacteria in that will eat all the plant material, and that all enzymes breaks everything down. We're just left with plastics. When we do that, we can then say, let's count how many plastics we have. We can filter things out. So that's what's shown here. This is a filtered image of plastics. And we can even start to use our AFM technique and look and say, how many particles do we have? How many nanoparticles? How many of these tiny, tiny, tiny pieces of plastic are in these samples? And it turns out actually for these samples, not much nanoplastics, and more kind of this medium scale size plastic that's smaller than we can see, but not the tiniest things that we can find. So that's one project we've worked on. We've also done a lot of work with other ocean environments. So for example, with Environment and Climate Change Canada, we have looked at kind of ocean animals in the Arctic, specifically a lot of work on polar bears. And there we were interested in how much plastic is in these polar bears. How much are they eating in their diet? Now, one way to do that would be to go and sacrifice a polar bear, but we don't want to do that because polar bears are having a hard enough time as it is. So instead, I didn't have to do this. Collaborators did, so I was very happy. They went out and collected polar bear poop. Basically, they collect scat. They then take it, they filter it, and we get the filter paper, which is shown here. And then we can go and measure it, and we can figure out basically how much plastic and what kinds of plastic are these polar bears eating. Turns out they're eating a lot of commercial packaging, it seems like, but that's already helpful because it kind of tells us where we should look about cleaning things up and how this plastic is getting into the ecosystem. We have other projects that, for example, with the NRC Ocean Program and OceanWise. So they're based in Vancouver, and they've done a lot of work looking at, say, plastics in the ocean. Now, they've done really nice work where they've looked at fibers and different plastics that are already kind of floating in the ocean, and we're working with them to say, well, let's look at the even smaller stuff. How much other stuff is there? So that's another project that we're working on, basically using our measurement techniques to say, like, what kind of plastics are there? Where are they coming from? What they have found is actually that a lot of the plastics they see come from clothing. So basically clothing fibers that break up and go into the ocean. So that's one of the things we're working with them to better understand where these plastics come from. Now, the final thing that I said we're interested in is how dangerous are microplastics? And that's actually a really complicated question. I told you at the beginning, microplastics used to be used in toothpaste. Nobody objected. You brushed your teeth, you spat it out, you swallowed toothpaste, just went through you, no harm, no foul. But plastics that come in the environment, they're different because they've been exposed to the sun, they've been exposed to UV, they've been mixed with things. They can become much more complicated. And understanding how those affect biology is actually a really hard question. And so one of the things we're working on is, like, how do we answer that question? What's a good way to understand the effects of microplastics on humans? Now, I told you microplastics are in the river, they're in the ocean. So why don't I just go and get a scoop full of river water and measure how it affects things? Well, there's a lot of other stuff in the river water, and the river today is not going to be the same as the river tomorrow and the day after that. And the river in my town is different than the river in your town. And so it makes it hard to do reproducible experiments. And that's one thing that's really important, is that we have to, if we want to understand this, it has to be reproducible. So instead, what we're doing is we're trying to make microplastics that look like what's in the environment. So how do we do that? Well, this is using a laser. And so what we have done is we've taken a laser and we focus it onto a piece of plastic, and we're machining the plastic very, very precisely. And that blue light that you see is actually kind of like a tiny lightning bolt. So what we do is we focus the laser, so we basically make a lightning bolt and we drag it across the plastic. And what that does is it generates ultraviolet light, so that's like the sun, generates heat, it generates shock waves, and it breaks apart the plastic. And this is how we're getting microplastics that are like what we find in the ocean and in the environment, and we can use it to then study how does it affect living things. And so that's kind of my very quick overview of the work that we do, metrology and measuring microplastics, trying to understand what they are in the environment. I am one piece of a big team at the NRC, and we, of course, as I said, collaborate with a lot of other people. So this is an area that the Canadian government and that we as a whole are really interested in understanding the problem, understanding the scope of the problem, and what we can do about it. So we work as a team and we work together. We're really trying to solve this problem. And I'd be happy to talk about any of these things that I talked about today, or more broadly about microplastics. So I hope you have some questions. I hope you learn some things along the way. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for that talk, Adrian. That was awesome. I think the way that you explained everything was not only amazing because it's such an interesting way to think about a product or a substance that we use in our everyday lives and then how it kind of goes back into the environment. Like if I think about myself today, how many times did I touch plastic? It would be taking some vegetables for breakfast
Yep.
out of the bag that I hold it in, or when I go to a coffee shop, all of the different like lids and things that you touch plastic in so many different spots, and they're produced for these purposes. It's for you
Right.
to use them in society. And then it's amazing to know that there's people that are doing that work on, okay, well, plastic, even though we use it for what the lifespan of it is 2 seconds, maybe
Yeah.
10 minutes
Yeah.
for most of the plastic
Yep.
uses, how it actually continues to exist in our environment and within us and other living creatures. It's really amazing to think about something that is so normal and how many times we touch it per day,
Yeah.
but then, and how few, I think, yes, how little we use it at the same time. We touch it so many times, but the lifespan of it is so short in its actual use.
Yeah, it's one of those things. You have the plastic, like you said, you might be only using it for a few minutes, but once you throw it into the environment, it's going to be there for a long, long, long time. Plastic is one of the things that it's like, the plastic I use today is almost certainly going to outlive me, in some form. And so it's and then it just becomes a question of where does it go, and it's and that's the thing that we really want to know. It's like, where does it go? How does it break apart?
Yeah, and I think it's so great to, have your talk here for all of the students that are joining us and thinking about how many times they've touched it, and then, really understanding that there's people who are out there looking and analyzing how it interacts in our environment. And the second thing, before we turn it over to questions, just because I'm so excited about this talk, is also as how you're taking what exists in the environment and then breaking it down into a microcosm, and like you're saying, a reproducible experiment, because that's how science really works. Is you see how something works in real life and you say that it's a problem, and then you take it in a really small scale, and then that's how you're able to understand the greater thing. So I think for the classrooms joining us today, it's a great insight on how real science is done and how we understand the world around us is through these tiny experiments, and quite sophisticated experiments too. That laser blew my mind that you were swirling around.
It's a lot of fun. I mean, the experiments are like, the equipment is very complicated, but it's I mean, the big thing is it's reproducible, because that's one of the biggest challenges, is that, if I really want to understand the world, I have to be able to not do it once, not do it twice. I have to be able to do it. You have to be able to do it. And it's reproducible experiments is something that's really a really important thing. And it can be really hard to reproduce experiments, but it's worth it.
And it's essential to understanding the world around us at the same time. Well, that's great. It's been great to get a chance to get an overview of all the work that you're doing, even though it's just a small amount. But why don't we turn it over so everybody else has a chance to pick your brain instead of just me here. So why don't we turn it over to Miss Murray's class coming in from Toronto. They're a grade 1 and 2 class. So I'm going to add them here, and you guys can have a chance to ask your questions for Adrian. So you're going to come up on the screen now, and I'll get myself out of here.
So guys, do you have any questions? You guys can wave, say hi.
Hello.
Hello. Hi. Do we have any questions? Raise your hand if you have a question for Adrian about microplastics. We have a question, I think, Simon.
If there's plastic inside coral, how are we gonna get it out there?
How are we going to get it out? That is a very good question. So for the bigger plastics, we can go and collect them on the beach, out of the water. For the microplastics, right now, it doesn't seem that there's a lot we can do. One of the ways people are trying to work on it is actually have bacteria that will eat the plastic. There's bacteria that eat oil, and they will clean up oil spills. And so people are working on ways to kind of get bacteria, let's say something that will actually turn the microplastics into good. But right now, there's not a lot that we can do. The one maybe saving grace is that actually a lot of the plastics sink, they turn into sand, So they kind of fall out of the environment, but it is a hard problem about how to remove microplastics. And that's one of the reasons we're so concerned about it, is they start to build up over time, and we'd like to understand better where they're going and maybe find ways to remove it. Right now, we don't have a lot of good options for removing microplastics out of the ocean. That's a very good question. And it's an important question to try and think about how we could do that going forward.
Are there any other questions coming from Miss Murray's class?
And do we have time for another question, or?
Yeah, you can do one more question.
Okay, who is sitting down really nicely? I think it is Gabriel. Go ahead, Gabriel.
So, like, if the plastic breaks down, how deep, when it gets to, like, how deep will it go?
How deep does it go?
Yeah.
So that actually depends on the plastic. So some types of plastic, they float in the water. So they'll actually just stay on the surface all the time. And then those are the type that, say, fish might eat by accident, because they kind of look like food floating on the surface. But there are other types of plastics that are heavy, and they'll sink. And people have found those types of plastics everywhere they've looked in the ocean. On beaches, in the deepest holes in the ocean, and you can find plastics everywhere now. So that's one of the things that's a bit tricky about plastics, is they'll get everywhere. And so it kind of depends on what kind of plastic. Some like to float, some like to sink, some kind of hang out in the middle, but not so much. Mostly they either float or sink.
Thank you so much for answering our questions. I think, guys, can you say bye? Give Adrian a round of applause for all of his help.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Miss Murray's class. We appreciate you. Thanks for joining in today. Awesome. I'll come back in here. I think that's a great question, and something I also thought about during your chat is how the different types of plastics, they're almost like different species in an environment, and how they're also particular and how they interact with it at the same time. So that was something I never had thought about before, but is obviously a way that you're analyzing it. Yes.
Yeah. It's I mean, one thing that I didn't talk about today, but is one type of plastic that turns out to be really bad is tire. So when you drive on a tire, it wears out. That actually breaks out into little pieces of plastic that go into the environment. And those ones are particularly bad, but it's kind of every kind of microplastic has its own behavior. And so understanding the problem of microplastics, you can't just say, I'm going to choose this plastic and understand this one. Plastics is a really complicated issue. And so we actually need to study all the different ones and understand how they interact with things.
That's something I thought about, where I experienced a hurricane in the last few months. I'm currently coming out of Mexico, and after the hurricane, you would see on the beach, on the coastlines, the impact of all of the deep ocean plastic coming up onto the shoreline.
Yeah.
And one thing that was really interesting to me is seeing all of the different, I'm not sure if it's called a microplastic, but styrofoam, the little pieces of styrofoam. Styrofoam breaks into these really fine pieces.
Yep.
And I found that was the hardest to clean up, because with bottles, you can pick that up and move it around, but the styrofoam, it would be impossible to go through and collect all of those pieces.
Absolutely. And that's the question that came from Madam Murray's class, is when you get these really small pieces of plastic, how do you go about cleaning them up? And it becomes that's it's one thing to say, like, I have a bottle, okay, I can pick that up and throw that out, and you should. But when I have this dust of plastic, how do I go and pick that up? It's hard. That's why it would be better to just avoid having it there to begin with. But we're working on that too.
Yeah, definitely a process. And one question that came up during your talk is you had shown that there was some clear plastics, and then also a way to look at them differently, because all clear plastics kind of look the same. You explained that you use different types of infrared light in different areas of the light spectrum to observe these. And then you showed a photo of the plastics being different colors.
Yeah.
Now the question is, did the infrared reflect those colors so it showed different density, or was this a certain dye, or how did you go about sorting those plastics into different colors to identify them?
So the infrared light, basically, you shine different colors of infrared light, and some of them are dark, some of them are bright, and so it's kind of think of it like a color photograph. So this one is red, this one is green, but everything is just in the infrared. And so you basically, what you do is you just shine different colors of light, and you say like, oh, this one, really one of the ways we measure it is you say this one gets absorbed. And so as it absorbs, it heats up. And you say like, okay, this plastic is absorbing this color of infrared light. And then we go to a different color and we say, does it get absorbed? Oh, it doesn't get absorbed. And what that is actually telling us is the molecules that are present in the plastic. So that's really what we're measuring. But it's just, you just look at, it's essentially just different colors, and it's like taking a picture, red fish, orange fish, blue fish, plastic that likes to absorb this color, plastic that doesn't. And it is just taking pictures, just using a different part of the light spectrum.
And similar to a concept called eDNA, it sounds like if you're looking at different things in the environment, you can kind of take a little piece of it and then put it in a machine, essentially. And all of the research that humanity has done over time, we're now able to identify different chemicals, or in eDNA's case, different species through their certain DNA sequences. So it kind of sounds like, even though it's a way more of a chemical way, it's a similar process to identification.
Yeah, that's really true. So we rely on the work that lots of people have done before us, where they will say, oh, this kind of plastic looks like this with this infrared light. This kind of plastic looks like this other one. So it's really matching is what you're doing. It's kind of pattern matching. You say like, how does this pattern match? How does that pattern match? And that's what we're looking for.
And I hope that with everyone joining us today too, is getting this insight into how science is done in a laboratory, is realizing it's not just a one-time thing. It's a lot of different people from all over the world collaborating to better understand the world around us, and especially going off of other people's research. It's something that it's not done alone, and it's accessible to be part of understanding the world and collaborating together. And with that being said, do you have any recommendations or comments to everyone who's joining us today about what you've understood through your research about plastic? Is there kind of an overall message or understanding that you've gotten that you'd like to share?
For me, the big one that I've taken away from it is I've just tried to reduce the amount of plastic I use, because the plastic is going to stay with us for a long time, and it's hard to get rid of. I try to reduce how much plastic I use. When I can, I try to reuse reusable bags or reusable containers. It's not always possible, but that's one of the things I do. And the other thing is that throw away your litter. It sounds simple, but it's like, a lot of the plastic, if it doesn't get thrown away, it ends up in the river, and then it ends up in the ocean, and then it ends up there forever. And so if you can just do a good job of keeping the environment clean, that actually goes a long way to helping things already. So those are two things that I've already, tried not to litter before, but now I really make a point of picking up litter, trying to keep things clean, and reduce how much plastic I use in my everyday life. Those are things that just kind of seeing how long the plastic is going to be there and going to stay with us, and where it goes once it gets into the rivers and oceans has made me think that it's a lot. This is a problem that's a lot easier to solve by avoiding the problem rather than trying to clean up the problem afterwards.
And something that's accessible for everybody to do in their daily lives,
Absolutely, yes.
Become more noticeable about the type of plastic that you buy and also what you do with it. So just being responsible and aware of the way that you interact with all of the materials that are around you.
Absolutely.
There was one question that has come in from Mrs. Kirk's grade 5 class, from Larry specifically. Thanks for your question, Larry. And Larry wants to know, does the color of the plastic always stay the same? Like, for example, blue, or does the color change? And I'm guessing this would be when you're doing that analysis, or maybe we could ask in two questions, where it's from that analysis that you're doing, and then also maybe seeing plastic as it interacts with the environment over time.
It's a very good question. And so it depends. So if you just talk about, say, let's just talk about the actual visible color first. So in the plastics, a lot of the visible color is due to dyes we put in. And so those dyes can fade over time. So something that started off blue can start to turn light blue and eventually white and gray. So that color can change. What's interesting is that for the plastics, when we look in the infrared, we're looking at the kind of the way the plastic is made up, really at the molecular level, and that doesn't really change much. So that's something, even though the shape might change, the color, like blue versus white, that might change. In the infrared, that actually doesn't change very much. And that's something that will actually lets us always determine where the plastic came from. And that's one of the reasons we have to use this infrared light, is that it's going to tell us really what the plastic is all the time, versus if I just look at the color or something like that I see in my everyday life, it doesn't always help me to determine where the plastic came from. So some parts of it change, some don't, but for the infrared, it's mostly going to work all the time.
Great. I hope that answers your question, Larry. And it's another way for you to look more closely into the environment around you as well. So thanks for that, Adrian. We have another question that has come in from the students from the HELP program. They were wondering what type of material the tracer pointer was for recording such fine details.
So that's the AFM tip, the very, very fine tip. It is mostly made of silicon. So that's the same thing that you make computer chips from and all sorts of other things. The making computer chips is all really small stuff. That's how you actually make the computer chips. And so we basically use the same technology that you use for making computers to make these very fine tips. So it's kind of the same material. You can get it made out of different materials, and sometimes we do, but it's essentially silicon or some other kind of silicon-based material. So that's the metal. It's a silicon metal. It's the same thing that's in your computers, the same thing that's in your cameras, the digital cameras. It's all silicon. It's a very useful material.
I've been hearing a lot about silicon and how it's used in a lot of our different technologies as well. So it's interesting that you can use it in different ways, like you're mentioning. There's another question that came through from the same class, and they're wondering, can we use apps on our phones to reproduce similar studies in our class? If not, could these studies be done in a classroom-friendly manner? Interesting.
Yeah. So for the scattering light experiment, I did that. I recorded that with my phone, and I used a laser pointer that I happen to have at home. And like I said, it was cornstarch and water. And so that's all stuff that is there already. The AFM is a bit tricky. You need the very fine tracer, and that I have to think about how to do that one in a classroom, not off the top of my head. For the infrared one, you can actually there are cameras you can get that actually let you look in the infrared, and there are some apps on your phone that actually let you basically not block the infrared light, and then you can actually start to take pictures in the infrared. And so that's something that actually does exist. It partly depends on the phone, because some phones, they actually purposely filter all the infrared light, so you can't do it the same way. But there are ones that don't, and so it's the laser scattering one is the easiest one to do. And like I said, it was a laser pointer that I just got off the shelf. You can do it with any color you want, and cornstarch and water, and it will work.
Simple things that you can find in your home.
Yeah, I did it in my kitchen.
Okay, great. The best laboratory.
Exactly. Yes.
There's another question that is coming from Mrs. Kirk's grade 5 class, and Kareem wants to know, do you think that we can live without plastic?
That is a difficult question. So right now, I think it would be very hard to live without plastic. We rely on it in a lot of things. That being said, I mean, we are currently working towards using less If I said I want to get rid of all microplastics, all plastics, that means no more tires. That's going to be a big change to make today. But I think we should work towards using less and less plastic, and that's something that we are working towards now. I just the other day I saw there was a big international agreement about reducing the amount of plastics that we use. I think we should work towards that.
It's always a process to learn how to change something we've been using for the last little bit. It creates a whole society change at the same time.
Yes.
Maria has a question for Mrs. Clark's class, and they want to know, what can the government do to help?
So, like I said, I think it was yesterday, the day before, there was an international agreement, framework for an agreement signed about reducing plastics. So the Canadian government at least has what we call a Zero Plastics Initiative, which is basically putting in rules about reducing, say, single-use plastics, and basically continuing to push towards less and less plastics used in everyday things. And so that's something that I think is worth continuing, and especially these international agreements, because plastic, once it gets in the ocean, it gets everywhere. And so Canada can't solve the problem by itself, but I think we should work with everyone together to really try and find a way to reduce plastic everywhere. And there is effort towards, getting industry to use less plastics, find alternative materials. So this is something that is an ongoing endeavor of the Canadian government, and it's something that I think we're going to continue to do going forward.
I think with any type of big systemic change, it involves a lot of pressure, and making these kind of changes that actually impact how we live our lives takes a long time, unfortunately. Yes. But what's great is, again, with talks like this and talking to so many of you that are joining in online, is the more educated we are about how plastic's being used in our environment, the more voices there are to really advocate for these changes.
Yes.
For example, we have the Environmental Leaders Program joining us, the HELP group, and they're asking a few questions here. And they asked a similar question to the last one about how is the government being involved with this? And they want to know, now that the data is being collected, how is this being used in terms of taking action beyond reducing? Do you think that with more research and showing and talking about this more, the government will be more open to making these changes and changing their bills and their regulations as well?
I think that the government is, I get funded, the government pays me to work on this to understand it. That's my job. If they say, we want to understand this better so we can have the information needed to make rules and regulations. And so from my perspective, the government, they say, we care about this. We recognize that there's a lot of potential problems here, and we need to understand it as well as we can so that when we make the rules, we do the right thing. And so that is something that is that basically they are working on all the time, and it's something that I think that the government is taking very seriously. And because, like I said, we're kind of, as the more information is becoming available, it's becoming clear that we didn't always understand the full scope of the problem at the beginning. And that's one of the reasons why there's these new initiatives, is that new information comes in and we say, all right, now we need to learn more. We need to understand the problem better.
Thanks for your expertise today, Adrian. And we're just about to wrap up here, but one other question, and maybe what you can do is just leave the students that are joining us today with how can they help, more opportunities. One of the questions from the Environmental Leaders Program that's joined us, they want to know if your organization ever employs or takes on high school students for summer support, and maybe if not that opportunity, how else can they get involved and learn more from your experience?
So I haven't worked with high school students before. I have, well, not in this organization, in other ones I have. One of the things that becomes a little bit difficult is if you're working in a lab, the labs can be dangerous. And so we do everything as safely as we can, but it's something that requires a little bit of care in how we do it. And so, but it is something that I have worked with people who wanted to help with image analysis and things like that. So there often are opportunities. It just depends partly what the person wants. And in terms of, say, if you want to get involved and help, there's lots of organizations that are out there. Like I said, one of the as far as I can tell, one of the biggest sources of microplastics in the environment is just waste. So if you want to go help, there's all sorts of organizations, that we're going to go clean up this lake, we're going to clean up this river, we're going to pick up the waste. That is something that is going to help. And sometimes it might feel kind of small, but every bit helps. It really does. And so that's something that's kind of easy to do. And as I said, the other thing on the individual level is just, where you can, try to reduce the amount of plastic that you use. That again, these are small things, but they're very easy to do. If you want to get more involved in the science, we need more people. This is a big problem, and it's going to require lots and lots of people and probably a long time to solve it. So I just say, if you're thinking about where to go, say after school, in terms of elementary school, going beyond that, there's lots of programs that are very interested in solving these types of problems, and we need all people from all walks of life to come and get involved.
I think that's a great message. We can't do it alone, and it's the reason we like these conversations is to let you know, like all the students that are joining us, is you can be a part of the change, and it's small steps, but they're big steps when we can do it all together. So thanks for all of your questions today, and Adrian, thanks for the talk. That was really fantastic to learn more about your work. That's really important. So it's really enjoyable. So
thank you very much.
Us. Of course, and hope to see you again soon.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And for the rest of everybody joining today, this is the middle of our Oceans Week celebration, and Adrian has been a great part of it. But if you're interested in tuning into any more, you can come into Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants on YouTube and either watch this one or tune into any of the other ones happening this week. So with that, I'll let everybody go. And Adrian, I'll leave you to the rest of your day in smoky Ottawa. And I'll see you all on another conversation. So take care, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.